your political correctness, you've come to the wrong place. It's Speak Out Long Island with Steve Levy, 1039 LI News Radio.
Hello, Long Island. Welcome to Speak Out Long Island with Steve Levy. I'm your host, Steve Levy, the former Suffolk County executive, and welcome back. We're going to have an action-packed show. It's very, very tight. We have so many guests today, but I think you're going to like it. It's going to be exciting. Of course, in my first segment, I'll do my normal rant, getting things off my chest. The second segment we have both a Democrat and a Republican to talk about what's going on the political front here on Long Island with two state senators leaving. We have Chuck Fuschillo, who's leaving to head up the Alzheimer's Foundation, and Lee Zeldin, who's going to be giving up his seat for Congress. And it could tip the balance of power in New York State. So we're going to talk to Elaine Turley, a Democratic leader in Smithtown, and Mark Murray, a prominent Republican in Sayville and Islip Town. And we're going to hear their perspectives on where we stand. The third segment, we're a very special guest. We're going to have Ed Cox, who will be calling in about the governor's budget that was unveiled this week. Ed, as you probably know, is the chairman of the New York State GOP, the Republican Party. The final segment, we'll have, weather permitting, Patrick Halpin, the former Suffolk County executive, fellow who I served with. I was a county legislator at the time. He was the executive in the late 80s, early 90s. He's going to be giving us a Democratic perspective to counterbalance that from Steve Flanagan, the head of the Conservative Society for Action here on Long Island. And we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of things from Governor Cuomo's statements about gun toters and those who are anti-abortion, those he considers extremists, and Steve's point of view on those issues as well. But let me roll right into my little rant of the day. This was the week of the Martin Luther King ceremonies, and every time around this year, we reflect back on this great man and what he meant to this country and how far we've come or have not come. And there have been a lot of pundits making note. Yes, we've gone a long way. We still have a long way to go. No, we haven't gone far enough. But there were some very provocative statements made over the last couple of days. One that's getting a great deal of attention is the president's remarks to the New Yorker magazine. And he took flack from some circles on it, though others like myself thought his remarks were rather reasonable. Basically, what the president said is, hey, there are a bunch of yokels out there who simply don't like me because of the color of my skin. And if he just said that, you might thought it was sour grapes and him trying to make excuses for his dipping poll numbers. But he prefaced it by noting, but on the other hand, I get the benefit of the doubt in many cases. People who vote for me because of the color of my skin. And that's certainly true with ethnic politics. It's no secret that Irish had voted for Irish in the day, Italians for Italians, Jewish people for Jewish people. It's not surprising that African Americans would vote for the first viable African American on the ballot. So I think his remarks, for the most part, were rather tepid, quite factual, and to the point. Where it gets crazy is when you listen to the remarks of a guy like Van Jones, who is a radical leftist, who was once a part of the Obama administration, who was so radical in his views that when the pressure came to bear, Obama had to set him loose. Van Jones was once an environmental advisor to the president. It was thereafter discovered that he had great deal of ties to those with communist leanings. He said he signed petitions that maintained that 9/11 was a plot by the Bush administration. Really, really crazy stuff. But now he's out there as a pundit on CNN and other places. Very articulate guy, but no less crazy. I mean, these are some of the knuckleheads from the far left that had infiltrated the administration. To Obama's credit, he let him go. To his detriment, he never saw it a problem to put him on his team in the first instance. But Van Jones was basically saying, we've actually gone backwards since Dr. King's day. And he lamented that jobs that African Americans had been getting in the public sector are starting to wane. Manufacturing jobs are starting to wane. As if we should be relying on the public sector to keep growing and growing and growing just to supply jobs for those who have been isolated and disenfranchised over the years. That's not what the role of a federal government is. And ironically, it's the abject explosion of government and the size of government, which led to high taxes, which led to the downgrade of the business competitive environment. That has led to a loss of manufacturing jobs that Van Jones laments. Now, obviously, automation, technology, global competition plays into that a great deal. But certainly when you have an anti-business mentality, as is the case with Jones, as is the case with the president who says, you didn't build that. The government somehow was responsible for you getting that business, not you taking a second mortgage on your house and sweating 23 hours a day trying to get your new business growing that started from your garage or your bedroom or your basement. That's the kind of mentality that leads to the demise of business. So when Van Jones says what we have to do to fulfill Dr. King's dream is to just spend more money on education, spend more money on bridges and roads, et cetera, et cetera. Well, didn't we just see that? Isn't that what the stimulus program was all about? Billions and billions of dollars, which, by the way, it makes sense in a very slow economy to try to churn the pump and get people to work. But it's not as though that was the savior. You can't always look to government to break people out of this cycle of poverty. Many would say it's government policies themselves that perpetuate it. But I thought it was really quite interesting how Jones went on lamenting how backwards we are going, talks about education, and yet we have seen more and more money thrown at education, whether it's on the federal level over the last two administrations or on a state level where we just increase spending to education dramatically over the years, and the educational industrial complex keeps on asking for more and more and more, or as though there's some kind of correlation between spending more money and getting higher results. If only that were the case, I think we'd all sit back and say, go ahead, spend the money. But it's not the case. It's been proven time and time again. You throw more money at it, it doesn't make a difference. But, here we see the growth of charter schools in many places to try to break inner city kids out of that cycle that comes with bad schools. And to his credit, the president has spoken a good game on this, but I don't think we really have seen any backup to really promote the charter schools, to give parents in inner cities an alternative. Let's see what happens in the second half of the president's second term on that. And by the way, a message to Mr. Jones. You know what the best program is to get someone out of poverty, whether they're black, white, Hispanic, Asian, doesn't really matter. You know what the best program is? Try a good economy. A good economy like you had in the 90s. It was better than any program that the government ever sponsored. When things were booming in the 90s, you were able to get rid of welfare as we knew it. Now it's coming back again as we knew it. You were able to get people jobs because the private sector was growing, and it truly was a case where it was a rising tide that was floating, that was lifting all boats, as John Kennedy once said. That is the key to getting people out of the cycle of poverty. It's making sure they stay in school, they don't have children when they're children, and it's having an environment where they can get a decent job with upward mobility. Yet Jones has this nostalgia, just like so many of the civil rights advocates have about the old days. It seems that they want victimization. They want this battle to go on because it gives them a reason for being. I was reading the Halperin book John Halperin, the guys who wrote Game Change, they followed it up with Double Down. And one of the things they mention is the inner circle Obama folks. It was African-American guys within the administration who had said, there's a professional class out there, a professional African-American group, a professional, I'll call them professional civil rights group, the Cornel Wests out there, the Sharptons, the Jesse Jacksons, who always are talking about victimization, who always have to have that type of confrontation so that they have a fundraising mechanism and a reason to exist. Well, that's what we see with Jones and his remarks. There is this nostalgia to look back on these amazing speeches of the 60s by Dr. King and the trials and the tribulations and the Jim Crow laws, and to almost want to have that kind of hostility and agitation so it gives them a reason for being. And it's sad because we have made a lot of progress and yet we do indeed still have a long way to go. But the question is whether we're going to get there by continuing the victimization mentality that people like Jones and Sharpton and Cornel West perpetuate, or if we're going to get to the point that, hey, there is some equal opportunity here. You have to take advantage of it. We have to keep families together. We have to make sure that young people value education and have a situation, a culture here where, as in China, Bill Gates is Britney Spears instead of here where Britney Spears is Britney Spears. We want to be emulate the intellectual, to emulate those who are working hard and moving up the ladder. And we need more people like Van Jones and even President Obama, as Bill O'Reilly often says, to set that example, speak out as to how important that is. And then, hopefully we can fulfill Reverend King's dream. In the same week, we had a lot of other things happening. A number of congressmen are reintroducing the whole hype over the voting rights bill. Now, you might recall that last year, the Supreme Court struck down a provision. I shouldn't say struck down a provision. What they said is that there is no longer a need for the federal government to be the gatekeeper and the monitor for a whole host of southern states whenever they wanted to do the slightest thing in election law. It was certainly warranted back in 1964 and in that era. Back then, there was obvious discrimination and attempts to hold back people of color from getting to the voting booth. Poll taxes, literacy taxes, things of that like. And the federal government, through Lyndon Johnson, prompted, of course, by Kennedy, he never made it to that point, but Johnson carried the ball over the goal line and got this magnificent legislation through. And it did its job. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court said last year. They said, look, we've gotten to the point now where you no longer need the federal government to be the monitor. So what did Democrats do? They went crazy saying, you've eviscerated the voting rights law of 1960s. People are going to go back to the poll tax days and the literacy tax days. And they did this for one specific reason, to make it sound like there was an attack by Republicans and conservatives against those of color on the voting realm. We're going to stop you from voting. Nothing of the sort, not even close to it. But the biggest culprit here was the media that allowed that myth to perpetuate. The media had an obligation to explain what that decision was and was not by the Supreme Court. It was not an evisceration of the Voting Rights Act. If there is discrimination, you still have the right to sue on the Voting Rights Act. You're not allowed to do the kind of things that were done back in the 60s to disenfranchise people to exercise their vote. All that decision said was, back then, you had to have the southern states get approval from the federal government for various election laws that they passed. Today, you don't need that. If they violate something, you can still sue them. You can still stop them from doing that. But that's all that decision did. And yet a whole campaign revolved around this silly myth that conservatives and the conservative court and Republicans were trying to snuff out the vote of the minority residents, citizens in this country. You know, another very important legal matter that came out this past week that relates to some extent is a decision by a Pennsylvania judge who threw out an attempt by the state of Pennsylvania to require that when you go to vote, you show a photo ID. And the point was, hey, you know, some of these elections are getting pretty close. There's some potential for fraud. There are some examples of fraud. We just want to instill public confidence and maintain public confidence in the integrity of the system. Well, when they put forth these laws in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, you had the attorney general fighting it. How dare they do that? You had the opponents, especially Democrats, saying, you know, you guys are creating a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. Where's the problem here? We don't have a rampant number of cases where people are going into a voting a booth or a school or a hospital, wherever they're going to vote, an auditorium, and saying, hey, I'm Joe Blow and I'm actually Jim Smith. Doesn't happen that often. But the key is, it does happen and it can happen. And even if it's so that it's 0.001% of the time, look at what just happened this past week here on Long Island. Connie Keppert, a councilwoman in Brookhaven Town, was certified the winner of that race by 4 votes. 4 votes. How many times have we seen this where votes were determined by 1, 2, 3 people? You can honestly say that Al Franken in Minnesota should never have been elected senator. Because after the fact, it was determined that there was a great deal of chicanery that went into that particular election. Too late. Oh, there were only a handful of bogus votes. Yeah, but he only won by a handful of votes. So to say that it is somehow disenfranchising people to vote because they have to have ID, give me a break. I'll tell you the most amazing irony here, the thing that flipped my lid. I was watching the Democratic convention in 2012 in North Carolina when this issue came up, and reporters were interviewing some of the Democratic delegates at the convention about this very issue. And it was hilarious to see these folks say, oh, that's so burdensome to ask people to show an ID to have to vote. Hey, all of you folks had to show an ID to get in your building there. You couldn't have gotten in to the Democratic convention without showing a picture ID. You can't get welfare without showing a picture ID. How many things do you need picture ID for? It's photo IDs just to survive in this world, whether you're rich, whether you're moderate income, whether you're poor. Somehow you get it if you need it. I'll give you another example that'll just blow your mind. It blew my mind. I like to play golf when I can. I can play a little bit more now than I did when I was a county executive or an assembly member. So one fall afternoon, my wife and I decide to play 9 holes, and we go out to a local county course. I like to play the county courses. They're well maintained, and being the fiscal conservative that I am, what the heck am I going to pay $50 for a round of golf when I can go right to a beautiful county course on the water and get right on that course and spend, $18 for the round and throw in another 12 for the cart. Okay, so I go in there, right? And you have to show your green card to get the county discount, proving you're a county resident, right? So I hand it to the young fella there at the pro shop, and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. It's expired." I looked at it. Yeah, you're right. It expired. Okay, how do I get a new one? Right? Well, we're going to need some ID from you, some picture ID. Let me. Here's my photo ID, my license. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I need one more piece of ID, photo ID, and I said, well, look, you've got my old card, which has my photo and has my address, and you have my current license, which matches that. It's got to be enough, right? No, so I'm afraid it's not. It says here you need 2 pieces of ID. So, he's a nice kid. He's being very professional, very, patient with me. And I said, all right. So my wife said, all right. So we give him, she gets out of her pocket, but here's our bank statement, it's got our address. I'm sorry, sir, that's not on the list. So then we go, all right, well, wait a minute, I'll go to the car, come back. Here's a phone bill. I'm sorry, sir, it's not on the list either. That's not going to do. Wait a minute. You have my old card. You have my license. You have my phone bill. Here's a letter from the Bar Association wanting me to repay my dues. It's at the same address, okay? Sorry, sir, that's not on the list. Well, what would be on the list? Well, yeah, a hunter's license, a library card. Well, I don't have a library card with me. I'm not a hunter. What the heck you want me to do here? And now I'm starting to get a little frustrated. Not mad at the kid, but just frustrated. Hey, if I were playing for welfare, I would have gotten it by now. I'm just trying to get a green card. So here's the young fella says, sorry, sir. So I go over to the administration, and they were kind. I got through it by the end of the day, and I got the extension. And it's not as though I was mad at this kid. He was doing his job. And good for Suffolk County for making sure you don't have cheaters coming in and pulling a scam. But the point is, here we are. I had to go through this just to get a green card to golf, okay? It was obviously a little overboard. But no, I can't be asked, or no one else can be asked, for a photo ID to vote. Come on, give me a break. So, you're going to see this issue again used by the liberals to say, here are these guys, dealing with the Voting Rights Act. They're dealing with these voter IDs. They're trying to bring us backwards. Nothing could be further from the truth. Stop playing the victim card and let's move on and let's look at our educational system and let's try to finally fulfill Dr. King's dream. All right, we're going to be back in our next segment with Mark Murray, a Republican from Sayville, and a good friend from Smithtown, Elaine Turley on the Democratic side. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Speak Out Long Island with Steve Levy. I'm your host, Steve Levy, the former county executive here in Suffolk County. Segment 2 here. And we have as our guest Mark Murray, who is an attorney in the Sayville area in Islip Town and also serves as the counsel to the Islip Town Republican chairman. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks a lot for having me, Steve.
We're also going to be joined in about 5 minutes by a counterpart. We're going to have a Democrat, a former Smithtown Democratic leader, Elaine Turley, who is an attorney in her own right, has run for office a few times, and we'll get into some very fiery discussion. But, Mark, I wanted to talk to you about something that's in your bailiwick, election law. In my last segment, I was talking about the Connie Keppert case, where she won by a bare 4 votes, and it went through the lower court, where at first she lost. Then it went to the appellate division, where they threw out some votes, accepted a few others. Then it went to the Court of Appeals. She wins. She's down by 4. She's up by 4. You've seen it all as an election lawyer, as to how crazy it can be, what's accepted, what's not, the wildest things you've seen. Tell us about this business. There's very few people I know who are really expert in the area of election law. And I'd like to get your background on some of the stories you've seen, some of the elections, and for our public's edification, tell us some of the things you've seen.
Well, there are very few people, Steve, because it's a really great way to ruin every summer. The petitions, as you know, come out in June, and they're filed by early July. Then there's a very, very rapid race to the litigation, because if there's any close calls, it all has to be worked out in time to have the election go off on election day, and more likely the primary day go off in September. So it's frantic. The cases go on and they're handled very quickly. The appeals are expedited. You can file a notice of appeal this year I filed a notice of appeal on Friday, and I was arguing in the second department the next Wednesday. I mean, normally it's 6 or 9 months before you get scheduled.
But it's all expedited because, if it's decided after the election, too late.
It doesn't matter. Right. So, I mean, we had a good one this year. I went up to the second department. There was a petition filed by a client of mine, Anthony Gralto, who was a Working Families member. He had 10 people sign a petition for him, and it's a very small turnout on the Working Families for the 8th Legislative District. The petition that he prepared said Working Family Party instead of Working Families Plural Party. So it didn't have the right name of the party. We went up to the Supreme Court originally struck out his petitions because it had the name of the wrong party on it. But the second department, following a long line of cases that resulted from the Bush-Gore race, and then a Voter Reform Act, an election law reform act about applying substance over form. And because the court didn't see any confusion in that case, they actually reversed the Supreme Court and allowed him to stay on.
So the difference was, is it Working Family or Families, which it's families technically.
Correct.
But they put family. Now, New York is known as probably the most hyper-technical state in the union. I mean, there have been notorious cases of people being thrown off the ballot for the most mundane reasons. I mean, what are some of the experiences that you've had on that? Well, and is it getting better?
Oh, it's definitely getting better since Bush-Gore, and under these reform acts, the courts have certainly put an emphasis on ballot access as long as there's no confusion or intent to confuse. But I mean, before the reforms, if you had a town councilman running for a seat for an unexpired term, even if he was the only one running, if it didn't say unexpired term, they'd throw it out. If there were any minor technical deficiency in the wording at the top of the petition, they would throw it out. Now, they really are looking at, on petitions at least, they're looking at signatures, the dates, the witness statement, the people who are signing that they're doing the right thing, and that the document is not confusing on what it's trying to do. In the past, there's an independence party in New York State.
As opposed to independent with a T at the end.
Right, an ingenious party. Frank McKay is the chairman of that party. He
who's a commentator on this station, yes.
Right. So he coined that phrase, and so I think there are a lot of people in the Independence Party who think they're not affiliated with a party.
They think they're blanks. They think they're independent, but they're actually in the Independence Party, which has grown to the point where it's number 3 on the ballot now.
Correct.
Right.
Well, it goes back and forth with the Conservatives. I think the Conservatives may have outpaced them in the last election. In local races, at least, the Conservatives are doing well compared to the Independence Party. But there was an attempt. There are also people who want access to the ballot. There are access to ballot petitions, where if you don't want to be a part of any party and you get enough petitions, you can have your name put on the ballot as well. They're called vanity lines by those of us in the industry. There was a person who tried to use the independent name, which was confusing with the Independence Party, so that one was struck down.
I was just listening to a show a little earlier with John Gomez, and he had Bill Donahue from the Catholic League or one of those organizations on, and they were talking about the Right to Life Party. It's gone now. The party's still there, but it doesn't have access to the ballot as a prime party the way you have Democrat, Republican, Independents, and Conservative. And why is that? They just failed to get enough votes?
Yeah, it's based on most of the ballot, access to the ballot is based upon the gubernatorial vote and the goobs, how many votes each party gets statewide. That's how every 4 years, depending on whether a Republican or Democrat wins, which party is row A and which party is row B, which party is row C. It's by total votes cast on the gubernatorial election. So
if they don't get enough votes in that previous gubernatorial election, they have to meet a minimum threshold, or they're gone. I think the same thing happened with the liberal line many years ago.
They're off the line. There's no liberal line now in New York either.
Right, but you can get some of these smaller. You can go on your own and garner signatures for a third party or an extra party, but it won't necessarily have its own line. It might be a tag. How does that work?
Well, it will have its own line unless there's no reason to create its own line, because a lot of parties, what they're doing is creating their own vanity line so that the candidate is on another line. If it's the same candidates on there represented it's the same candidate is represented in several parties, there's no reason to use up another line, because as especially with presidential years, the number of lines, the number of parties gets quite long. So they can give them what's called a stamp, which would be the icon of that party next to another one. So you could do it that way too.
But I know, for instance, I wanted a separate line going back in 1985, my very first race. A mutual friend of ours, Mike DeWidziak, was working with me heavily, still very heavily involved in as a political, I don't know if it's just operative, but a political strategist. And we decided it would be a good thing to get this line called Ratepayers Against Loco, because I was a Democrat at the time, running in and you hail from this area, 80% Republican at the time.
I cut my teeth in campaign law, not campaign law, but campaign management by running candidates trying to knock you out.
And thank you very much. And we're good friends now, ladies and gentlemen. But the point is, I knew there were these rock-bed Republicans for generations who were not going to pull the lever for a Democrat. So let's get another line. So I had to go out myself, get a bunch of signatures, and we qualified. And we got on the line, which was so fortuitous because that was the year, 1985. What happened in 1985?
Right.
Hurricane Gloria, right? In September of that year. And there were so many people ticked to the gills with Loco that I got about 8 or 9% in that line, which made the difference in a razor-thin 300-vote victory. And it's because I went out and got those signatures. And you see this all the time where people are going out to get the signatures, but so many of them get thrown out for various reasons. I mean, what are some of the craziest reasons that you've seen?
Well, it favors those who have the experience in doing it, because a lot of people get filled with vim and vigor, and they have a particular issue that gets them to get involved. But there's so much that you have to do in such a short period of time to do it, that a lot of these campaigns or candidates run afoul of the rules. And while it was a lot of times in the past hyper-technical and designed to keep them out, the effect is to keep them out. But reality is you're facing that primary date.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of time.
I'll tell you the craziest situation I had. I was running for Ohio office, and I was getting signatures, and my opponent was getting signatures as well, so that he can get a third line. And I was in this senior citizen complex, and I'm talking to some of the folks, asking them to sign my petition. And they said, "Oh yeah, well, yeah, some ladies had come by last week to get signature for that same position." I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Okay," so I put it in the back of my mind. And then what you do is, once the petitions are all filed, you look at the other guy, your opponent's petitions, to see if you see any fraud, any mistakes. A lot of times you have the husband signing for the wife, or the wife signing for the husband, which they should not do. That's illegal.
Correct.
And you could tell from the handwriting. In this case, we saw my opponent notarizing the bottom of the sheet, certifying that he had witnessed all of these people signing the petition. And I'm looking, and I see the addresses, and I'm looking back, and wait, that's the complex where I was at. They didn't say that he came to the door. They said these two ladies came to the door to sign. So we challenged it, and we went to court, Mark, and it was the most hilarious thing. He wouldn't back down. So our lawyer actually put him on the stand and started questioning him and said, "Well, how do you explain, you signed this. I actually brought the old ladies into court and said, no, he didn't get a witness the signature. Two ladies did, two blonde ladies did." And the judge asked him, "Well, how do you explain this, sir?" He says, "Well, I was there. I was watching them do it." And then the lady, the older lady I brought, said, "No, he wasn't there." And his remark was, "I'm not making this up. Well, I was hanging out in the bushes." "Well, why are you hanging out in the bushes?" "I didn't want to scare them." It was so ridiculous. The judge didn't know whether to laugh or throw him in jail. But long story short, they threw his petitions out. I was on the ballot. I wound up winning the race. But that's the kind of stories you get in this field.
Yeah. That story has been around for a while. That's a classic. I've had ones where when there's a person contesting my client's ballot, and I have them identify the person who came to the door to full detail, and then have the person come on the stand, doesn't look at all like the person was described, and they're the ones who signed the witness to the petition. It happens. It happens. It happens a lot, and there's a frantic pace to get these things filled out and get them properly filed, and there's every effort on both major parties to make sure that the petitions are in good shape before they go in. But you just never know. You don't have time to really compare them until they're all filed.
Wild stuff. Well, let me shift gears here because I want to get your opinion. I was hoping to get Elaine Turley's. She must have gotten detained. She hasn't called in yet. Maybe she will throughout this segment. But I wanted to get your perspective on what's going on with the openings in various races this year. The Republicans are hanging on by a thread in control of the New York State Senate. And really, it's amazing that they have any kind of control because they have fewer numbers than the Democrats do in the Senate, but they've forged this coalition with 4 very independent Democratic senators. Now, we have Senator Lee Zeldin leaving, so he says, to run for Congress. Can't do both.
Nope.
Well, yeah, one or the other. Chuck Fuschillo, very popular, shoo-in for re-election senator, right on the Nassau-Suffolk border, says, I'm giving up the seat. Everybody wondered why. Well, he's got a wonderful job heading up the National Alzheimer's Foundation in New York City, so people understand the gravity of that position and say, okay, we throw him a pass. 2 big openings. And things are changing demographically within these districts. So the entire balance of power within New York State politics and government can be thrown out of whack this November with this election. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What is their value from your perspective as a strong Republican advisor for the Republicans to maintain control?
I think I haven't heard on Lee's seat, at least, any Democrat who's come out looking for the seat. There are a couple of Republicans and one conservative that have voiced an interest in that seat. It's indicative of I think how well the Republican Party on Long Island has been in nurturing new candidates instead of just rehashing old ones who get knocked out of a race and put back into another slot.
Well, I've heard Anthony Semp's name. He's a councilman in Islip Town, a first-termer.
Right. The only 2 that I've heard declare their interest in the seat so far are Dean Murray from Brookhaven and Anthony Sempt.
Now, Dean was a former assemblyman who lost his seat the past election to Hennessy out in the Mastic-Shirley area, which is where Lee Zeldin hails from. There was talk about Lee possibly running to get his seat back, but now he's talking also about running for that Senate seat, so that should be interesting.
Yeah, and there are other candidates that may be considered. I don't know where they are with that. I think it's great though that there's at least 2 out front in the Republican Party that have shown a great interest in that, Republican and Conservative Party that have shown a great interest in that seat, where there's really none on the Democrats. It's really
I heard Kate Browning, the legislator, her name kicked around, but I think she's already come out and says she has no interest in towing it up to Albany. Paul Pontieri, the fantastic mayor of Patchogue, who I sing praises for all the time, I don't really know if he's going to go for it, but I've heard his name thrown around. I don't know if Rob Calarco, who is just got reelected as a Democratic legislator, has interest either, but it's had been a Republican seat forever with, I believe it was Cesar Trunzo.
Trunzo had it for, I think, 30 years.
And then everything got shaken from its roots when Brian Foley won. But that, I'm sure, is going to be at the forefront of the Republican campaign this year as to what happened after Brian won.
Well, the impact of a Democrat getting that seat is that Democrat got muscled into supporting the Democrats from New York City, and he voted for the MTA tax, and that's why I think he was a one-term senator. It's something that was brutal on Long Island, and if the city Democrats look at upstate as being, having economic challenges, and Long Island has this big fat tax base, and just looking for ways to get the tax money from Long Island into the city.
It's interesting. Newsday did a little spin cycle on this, but it's common knowledge that there is so much concern about having a balance here in Long Island, that even Rich Schaefer, the chairman of the Democratic Party, for the longest time, actually, whether with a wink or a nod or silently, was supportive of the Republicans maintaining control, because he had said the Democrats, when they're in control, they just have disdain for Long Island. It's so city-centric. I experienced that myself. First one, I actually ran against Cesar Tronzo back in 1990. I'd been in office for 4 years, and they talked me into running. I didn't have the fire in the belly, but I did it. And it was a mistake running because they promise you $300,000 and they give you about $3. But I remember when their posters came out from the Democratic Senate committee, and they were all city-centric. And here were the issues you got to run on: gun control and abortion. And I said, oh, what are you, crazy? Where do you come up with this? Well, we did our poll. And, 80% of the people were against assault weapons. And, 68% of the people were pro-choice. You should run anything. I said, you guys don't have a clue. That doesn't measure intensity. I knock on a door. Nobody's talking to me about assault weapons. No one's talking. A few people will talk about abortion and choice, but they're pretty much locked into their realm, and they're very rare. People are talking about taxes. They're talking about affordable housing. They're talking about jobs in the economy. They're talking about traffic in their backyard. These guys did not have a clue, and even Richie Schaefer understood this.
Well, Schaefer, he had a very close relationship with Owen Johnson, who was the senator from his area, the Babylon area.
Who bailed out Babylon when Schaefer was the
right, and Schaefer didn't forget that. But he's also wise enough to understand that he had a better chance of getting state dollars through a Republican senator than through a Democratic Senate, because that money would be, you'd hear the whooshing sound westward into the city from all.
Well, we were hoping to get a counter perspective from Elaine Turley here today. She couldn't make it, but I'll tell you, there is something to be said. Whether it's state aid to education or blocking an MTA tax, or even if you're a county executive. I was a county executive from 2004 to 2011. I found that I had more success going to Republicans, my local Republican senators, even when I was a Democrat, to get something done, than for that short 2-year period where the Democrats were in charge from New York City. It was hard to get appointments with them. You were low on their totem pole. They didn't feel that you were part of their sphere. Whereas the Republican bloc, and there were about 9 of them at any one time, they could stop the whole state. When they were in the majority, everyone had to go through them. Whether you were the governor, whether you were Shelley Silver on the assembly side, you couldn't get anything done unless you, I don't know if you use the word, horse traded or negotiated or got the blessing of the Senate. And that really was good for Long Island. And now we see with these 2 seats open, who knows what's going to happen. The demographics are changing within these 2 districts.
They're definitely changing Republican and Democrat, but there still leaves open a wide variety of blanks and independents who go both ways depending on the issues and the candidates involved. And my feeling has always been, and I tell people, you vote for your own personal interests because that's what matters to you. And the independents, even the Democrats, as Schaefer has shown, are better off with protection of getting support, state money for Long Island by keeping that Republican bloc for just the reasons that you identified.
In the last minute we have, I was going to ask Elaine. Pat Vecchio was just elected. He's 84 years old. He's setting records for being there the longest time. I happen to like Pat a lot, but I would think that she was be in favor of term limits. Okay, what are your thoughts on the subject, whether it's local or on the state level?
Personally, I've never been a fan of term limits. I think the term is limited by the support you have of the voters, and that when you don't allow for institutional elected officials, people who've been around for decades, to be in there to run things, then you're really giving over the control of the government to the bureaucracies. because they're the ones with the experience, and people are rolling in and out from the elected spots.
Yeah, and a newbie is going to be dependent on staff and probably just as dependent on the special interest as well, because they want to get reelected at least for their first 12 years. So,
Correct.
Hey, Mark Murray, thank you so much for coming by. We hope we're going to have you back on the show real soon.
Pleasure, anytime.
And ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We're going to have in our next segment Ed Cox, the chairman of the New York State GOP. In the final segment, we'll have Pat Halpin as a Democratic alternative. We'll be right back.
Correctness, you've come to the wrong place. It's Speak Out Long Island with Steve Levy, 1039 LI News Radio.
Hey, welcome back to Speak Out Long Island with Steve Levy. This is Steve Levy, the former Suffolk County executive, welcoming you to the third segment of our show. In our final segment, in about 20 minutes, we're going to have Patrick Halpin, the former Suffolk County executive, to give us a Democratic perspective on some of the Cuomo speech and the Cuomo budget. But right now, we are very fortunate to have a Republican perspective from the top dog himself in New York State. That is the GOP state chairman, Ed Cox. Welcome to Speak Out Long Island, Ed Cox.
Hello.
Hey, Ed. Hey, it's Steve Levy here. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
No, it's a pleasure to be with you. We just listened to the governor give his budget speech.
Well, you know, I have to tell you, Ed, I get your emails, and they are, I don't know, you know, I have to assume you're writing them, or, you know, if you're getting some help from some of the assistants in your office, whoever it is, what a team you got going, because they are phenomenal. And if these memos were read by the average public, what a different perspective they would have on what's going on in New York State right now, as opposed to what people will see or read in a soundbite. I mean, just for example, all the fanfare that came about in the State of the State address a couple of weeks ago, you know, first and foremost, that jumps into my mind, this nonsense, this myth that has been perpetuated throughout the media and pushed by the governor, that there's this $2 billion surplus. And, oh, look how I've managed the state. I've got this surplus, and it's an election year, and I'm going to give it back to everybody as a property tax cut and a business tax cut. And then I read your article and say, wait a minute, this is a lie. Tell us about that. It's amazing what I read, and you guys are spot on.
Well, look, he said we've got a $2 billion surplus. But if you take a look at the chart that they quickly ran by you during his speech, there's no surplus in fiscal year 2015, the next fiscal year. The surplus is 3 years out. And you know very well from having been a county exec, you know, to project 3 years out, given especially where the national and state economies are, and both are in a very parlous situation, that can change very quickly.
And I would have got my brains beaten out if I ever put out a budget or had a press release saying, we anticipate a $100 million surplus 3 years down the road, so I'm giving a tax cut, a projected tax cut. That people would go nuts. There'd be editorials galore. How do you project a surplus and build policy around something 2 or 3 years down the road? You don't know what's going to happen 2 or 3 months down the road.
That's exactly it. And then he goes on to say, well, spending's down. It's not. It's up. He says taxes are down. They're not. They're up. Taxes are actually, I'm looking at where they've actually gone up over his tenure this is state taxes, from $60 billion up to $70 billion, a $10 billion increase in tax collections.
Well, I have to say,
about $4 billion of which resulted from his increase in the rates that people are taxed.
And I have to tell you, it was brilliant politically by Cuomo. You got to give him kudos for his brilliance politically, because what he basically did I remember when he was running for office saying, you know, when this temporary surcharge on our taxpayers expires, You have to let it expire. And if you don't, you are in effect raising taxes. That's exactly what he did. He didn't let it expire, took that increase, and then handed out a few pennies to the middle class, termed it a middle-class tax cut, and had every editorialist, or just about every editorialist other than the Post and the Journal, and a lot of these amateurs around the state actually putting in headlines, Cuomo gives us a tax cut.
Exactly. Look, you taught me this when you were campaigning to be governor, and I followed your record. You got to protect the taxpayer. That's why you were elected and reelected and were so popular in Suffolk County. And you got to protect the taxpayers. That's what Rob Astorino has done in Westchester County, but very few others have done that. And that's what Cuomo isn't doing. It's all smoke and mirrors, and this budget's smoke and mirrors. Taxes are actually up over his tenure by $10 billion on a from $60 billion to $70 billion.
Now, I also heard, Ed, that we actually have a deficit for this fiscal year, according to the controller. Is that not correct?
That's right. 1.9. Actually, he's projecting for next year a $1.9 billion deficit. The controller, the Democratic controller.
I mean, this is just mind-boggling. I mean, here you have a press release, and he's standing up there with a straight face saying, we've solved our fiscal problems. We have a surplus and we're giving it back to you. Of course, it's an election year, but we're not going to give it back to you until after the election. And oh, by the way, there's a couple of catches to that. Can you explain that? It's not necessarily going to be a property tax break for everyone, is it?
No, it's very complicated, and whether he can work it or not, he's trying to force consolidations with it. That's part of it, and I don't know how much you can say by consolidations. You would know better than I, as a former really good county executive who focused on protecting the taxpayer, and the number of different districts there are in Suffolk County, whether you can save that much by consolidating, and whether you can actually force consolidation by holding a small amount of funds which can go to property tax cuts for the county. I don't know if that works or not as a mechanism.
Well, I do know, Ed, that there is potential in consolidation, and I'm a big believer in it. But what's interesting is, people think they're getting this tax cut, and number one, it's conditioned on there actually being a surplus, so that's one condition. And the second one, like you say, is that it's conditioned on their locality showing to the approval of these bureaucrats in Albany that they have taken enough steps in their subjective opinion, that is the bureaucrats in Albany, that they have consolidated. I know this much: when Governor Cuomo was the Attorney General in 2009, with great fanfare, he said, we've revolutionized the way that we're going to be able to consolidate. It's going to be so much easier now. Since that point, Ed, of the 10,000 taxing jurisdictions in New York State, I think 2 or 3 have actually consolidated. So the idea that within the next 2 years, everyone's jurisdictions are going to consolidate to make them eligible for this is pure folly. I commend him for giving incentive for them to doing so, but people are thinking they're getting this break. I don't think it's going to happen.
You know what it is? It's like teacher evaluations, which he said he was going to do teacher evaluations and made I'm going to lobby for the kids. They don't have anyone representing them. I'm representing the children of New York State, and we're going to make sure they're teacher evaluations. And then he got into conversations with the teachers' unions, and we'll let the district negotiate it with the teachers' union, and then we will give them funds when they finish their negotiations. And as Mayor Bloomberg pointed out, who really wanted to do it right in New York City, and it was hard to do, most of the districts did do that, and they got their funds, which both the unions and the teachers wanted. But guess what? There's a side agreement with respect to the evaluations. And as pointed out recently in a Daily News editorial, the evaluations haven't been affected.
So more style than substance on this.
It's rhetoric. He just does enough substance to support his rhetoric. And,
well, I'll tell you, I read, again, I don't know if I heard you say this or read it, but it was a spot-on analysis. I heard you say the governor is excellent, and he gets kudos for being able to identify a problem and articulate the problem. The fault lies in his inability to deliver and bring us over the goal line. Now, when he wants to deliver, whether it's for gay marriage or for ramming through that gun law, he can do it very quickly. But when a special interest on the left pushes back a little bit, he caves. And I saw that last year when I was excited, because for years I've been fighting to get a cap on mandatory arbitration. We have police officers here on Long Island making $200,000 a year. Something has to happen. And I heard Governor Cuomo saying, we've got to do something about it. God bless this guy. He's got the guts to talk about what has to happen. And he proposes this 2% cap a la along the lines of what Christie did in New Jersey, and say, finally, we're going to get some relief. What does he do? He puts the union on the panel to come up with the solution. The union says, no way. And he says, okay, no way. And it's all gone. Never happened.
Yeah. He understands, because he is brought up in it. It's part of his upbringing. He understands the rituals and the rhetoric of New York State politics. And he knows how to balance the interests. What he is missing is making sure that the substance that New York needs to arrest its decline and start going in the right direction economically, that he doesn't understand. How to right-size the budget by doing that, and how to, and that takes courage. What he's lacking is political courage to get the right thing done, and that's a tragedy because he does understand what the right thing to do is. But he doesn't get it done because he doesn't have the political courage to back up his rhetoric.
And, it is tough because we've seen the guys who do have the courage, like a Rob Walker, okay? Scott Walker, excuse me. Rob Walker is the deputy over in Nassau, and I do this all the time. But Governor Scott Walker, I mean, you talk about the courage of this man. He's straightening out that state, but boy, he was willing to go to the wall. He was willing to get attacked. It almost looked physically. I mean, they were thuggish how they were going after this guy, but he stood his ground, said, this is the right thing to do. This is what I was elected to do on my mandate. I'm going to make it happen. And now you're seeing that state turn around. You see it with John Kasich in Indiana.
You're talking. In Ohio.
Ohio, Indiana is Mitch Daniels. Excuse me. And you see it with Christie. I mean, Christie's having his problems, but Christie had the moxie to go up against that state legislature. They took their bobs. It doesn't look like Andrew Cuomo was willing to go that next step.
Now, here's the difference. And you're talking about two governors who I've gotten to know very well, because they've come to New York a lot, obviously, for different reasons, for fundraising and to speak and otherwise. But let's take Governor Kasich in Ohio. He won, I think, 55%, whatever, of the vote. And, boy, he then said, I've got one goal in life, and that is to make Ohio more business-friendly, to bring jobs, bring income back to Ohio, to make our economy grow so children stay here rather than when they, after school, going to Texas or Florida or Tennessee or North Carolina, where the tax situation, the business. And, he set to work like a demon. Focused on that. He brought in a lot of really people who understood the problems, put them in commissionerships. They all worked hard. They worked as a team. And let me tell you, they cracked a lot of eggs. He dropped down to 38% in his popularity. 38%. Because it's tough to do. You're breaking a lot of interests that are going to make a lot of noises, and that has an impact on the voting public. But then after the public looked at the reforms, they said, gee, these reforms are working.
Well, the same thing happened with Ronald Reagan.
He's up to, it's like Reagan. His popularity is now going up because people are saying, same with Scott Walker. Walker's popularity. And Cuomo did just exactly the opposite. He wanted to keep his poll ratings high the whole time, and so it's a lot of rhetoric, no substance, but his job approval rating has gone down continually to where it dropped at one point down to 44%.
You know what I think's ironic, Ed, is how the hard work of Scott Walker and John Kasich actually inured to the benefit of Barack Obama in 2012.
You're right.
Because here are these guys making the tough decisions, straightening out their economy, and now the people saying, hey, things aren't really that bad over here. Well, that was not because of Barack Obama. That was because of your governor making the tough choices. And when they do, we'll continue things going as they are. It's really weird the way that works, but it's a fact, I guess,
Well, it's the stuff that you did in Suffolk County. It's tough to do, but in the end, when the election, if you do it, people will respect you for it. In the end, when re-election comes around, they said, yeah, he did what he said he was going to do. It was tough to him, but it was good for the county, and you get re-elected.
Well, I wanted to dovetail into, there's talk of in the budget trying to cut property taxes down the road, which you already said may or may not happen, but there's still the whole failure to tackle spending on the local level. And there have been calls for mandate relief forever and just a lot of window dressing. I remember a panel they put together that was headed by Larry Schwartz a few years ago. It was like 89 pages of fluff. I commented on.
I know. I saw it. And basically, there was no mandate relief at all. There are two big things: Medicaid reform and mandate relief. Those were the two big. And of course, there was a pension reform also.
Well, speaking of pension, we had. Wasn't it one of his co-chair who said, "Hey, Governor, I heard all the rhetoric. Where's the relief?" And didn't she have a mini rebellion going on there last year?
No, Mayor Minor of Syracuse, who's co-chair of the Democratic Party, and I've certainly talked to her about this because at a conference where this was brought up. But here's the governor came out saying we need pension reform, and he talked big about pension reform. Then obviously government employees unions, and he started negotiating about it, and all the things that he promised were really watered down. One of the things I really recall was he was going to establish defined contribution plans as an option.
And defined contribution being like a 401k in the private sector, as opposed to a defined benefit in the public sector where people get a guaranteed rate of return on their pension. Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly. But people can manage their own funds in it. Even though it didn't look as rich on the surface, people could decide where they wanted to invest within that contribution, and they could leave government and take the funds with them if they didn't like their job in government, had a better opportunity in the private world. They could go and do it without giving up their pension.
And most importantly, taxpayers wouldn't be on the hook with a defined contribution program as they are now with a defined benefit program.
But you know what? It was only an option, but the unions insisted, we don't like it at all, take it out, and the governor took it out.
Well, we're trying to get that back.
Very, very weak as a result. And then he comes up with this smoothing plan because government pensions are taking the contributions are required, taking big amounts of money out of the county budgets and local budgets. And so he's put in a smoothing plan where, in fact, you could put off some of those required payments. And that's when Mayor Minor said, that smoothing plan, it doesn't work, Governor. And she spoke up and said, your level 6 pensions, your new pension reform, isn't strong enough to support the smoothing. I'm not going to do it. It's just putting the problem off to the future.
That's strong medicine.
Rob Astorino called it crack cocaine.
Yeah, it didn't really address the root of the problem, which is, some of these guys collecting overtime, doubling their salary in the last couple of years. So their $75,000 base salary becomes $175,000, and you base 30 years of retirement on that. It's one of the reasons we're going broke. There was a chance to try to fix that, and again, it was pretty much punted.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
with the Medicaid reform, it was incredible. If you listen to the language in the governor's budget speech they just did, he is looking to be bailed out because there wasn't any real reform in Medicaid. He's looking to get bailed out by the federal government by this $10 billion waiver. And what he actually said, if you listen, said that the systems that we put in place saved a lot, but we need $10 billion from the federal government to implement our systems. Believe it or not, that's what he said. So if you need $10 billion to implement the systems, because the systems are already in place that saved a lot of money for the federal government, therefore the rhetoric itself is not logical. Medicaid reform has been illusory.
In the minute we have left here, the Senate is up for grabs. We have Republicans who are in this coalition with 4 independent Democrats for control of the Senate. There's 2 senators from Long Island who are leaving, Republicans. How important is it to the public to maintain that Republican sense of balance in the Senate in about a minute?
Very important. We are of the 12 bluest jurisdictions. There are 24 houses of the legislature. The only one that is Republican, where there's Republican control, someone is here. We need to pick up 3 seats. I think we're going to pick them up, and we need to hold on to the Fusella seat and the Lee Zeldin seat. And I think we will, in fact, hold on to both because this is a great year, one of the best years we're ever going to have, thanks to all the problems of the Obama administration and of the Cuomo administration, too, because the rhetoric's there, but the substance not, and the people in New York State understand that.
Well, I'll tell you, it is so important to have a counterbalance out there. And if people want to read your newsletters, how would they get access to it?
They get access to it by nygop.com.
I'll tell you, I really recommend it for political aficionados. They're incredibly well written, to the point, and they do provide a balance to the press releases. And oftentimes, you will see those press releases just translate right into print without any kind of, tough questions asked, as we were talking about with this phantom surplus that he's gotten away with. So, hey, Ed, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the show. I heard you on John Gomez. I thought you did a great job. I'm so honored you came on my show, and I hope we'll have you back in the future.
I'd love to do it. Always a pleasure to work with you, Steve.
Thank you. Take care, Ed. Talk to you soon.
You too.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear in the next segment a counterbalance to our GOP chairman from Pat Halpin, the Democrat who was once a Suffolk County executive here in Suffolk. So stay tuned for that exciting part of our show. Welcome back to Speak Out Long Island with Steve Levy. This is Steve Levy, the former Suffolk County executive, for our 4th and final segment of today's show. We're very happy to have with us in studio Steve Flanagan, the president of Conservative Society for Action, and a fellow who'll be joining us on the phone, a good friend and person I served with in government for many, many years, another former county executive, that being Patrick Halpin. Welcome to the show, Pat. Can you hear us? Pat will be joining us momentarily. And I want to thank Steve for making the trip. It's a brutal day out there, but we appreciate you coming down, and brutally cold out there, but we're going to get right into it. We were talking about the state Senate in the last portion of the program. I was talking about the state budget, and now I want to talk about some remarks that were made by Governor Cuomo. And I think have we been joined by Patrick?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, great, Pat. I'm just posing to both of you guys. I wanted to talk about it with Ed Cox in the last segment, but we ran long. But this would be a nice way to start off this segment. Governor Cuomo, was that a slip, President Cuomo? Watch out.
I hope not.
Maybe that's why he's making these statements to help bolster him in a potential primary. But he made some statements that are certainly making a lot of attention. He was on a radio program in upstate in Albany saying that New York State is not a place for what he considers extreme conservatives, extreme Republicans, those who are anti-choice, anti-gay, pro-assault weapon. And it conjured up some remarks that were made by his dad when he was governor. Back in the 80s, Mario Cuomo made a statement about, quote, the NRA hunters who drink beer, don't vote, and lie to their wives about where they were all weekend. It's like, wow, the acorn doesn't fall too far from the tree here. Steve, you've been saying a lot of people are insulted by this. I'm sure Patrick has a different perspective, but you're ready to tee off, Steve. What's your thoughts on these remarks?
Well, it's funny. When you first hear these things, you're almost in a state of disbelief. A tradition in our country is, of course, you get elected, you duke it out in the election, you have some exchange of ideas, and then somebody assumes office. And it's always been our assumption that they represent all the people, not just the people that elected them, because invariably you're going to have a huge portion of the population that doesn't vote for anybody. Even in the last election, you still have 47% of the people who are opposed to the people sitting in power. We have a long tradition in this country of the loyal opposition. The party out of power is supposed to have ideas, suggest ideas, and present an alternate platform. But it's never occurred to us that, there would be somebody who's sitting in a position of power who would sit there and alienate people who have beliefs that are, counter to what he might hold. I was astounded, to be honest with you. I mean, he's not a stupid guy. Like you said, he has aspirations for president. Who would go out there and say that people who are in favor of the Second Amendment have no place in New York? How would you say that people who believe in pro-life have no place in New York? And how do you say that people who perhaps feel that, traditional marriage is the right way to go have no place in New York?
Well, Patrick, do you think that this was calculated? I mean, it certainly was at odds with his the governor's State of the Union address, State address, where he says, "We are one New York. We're not upstate. We're not downstate. We're not red. We're not blue. We're not Democrat, Republican. We are one New York." But it sure sounds like he's talking about two New Yorks here. What are your thoughts?
Well, actually, I just want to go back to your opening comment about the acorn or the apple or whatever metaphor you want to use, not falling too far from the tree. Other than Andrew Cuomo looking a lot like his dad and at times sounding like Mario Cuomo, his politics are actually much more centrist than some people would have described Mario Cuomo. Although Mario Cuomo does have the distinction of opening up more prisons than any other governor in the history of this state.
And then selling them, but that's a whole different point.
But that said, Andrew Cuomo is really governed as a centrist. Now there are some areas where, frankly, he did upset people who feel that the Second Amendment is absolute, that gun owners should have a right to whatever guns they can possess and for whatever rounds that those guns can hold, and they shouldn't be required to go through rigorous background checks. But New York State actually settled that issue a long time ago. Steve, you and I both served in the state legislature. New York State has some of the toughest gun laws in the nation. They got tougher after the slaughter of the children in Connecticut. But frankly, that did upset some people who thought that the state had gone too far. I think that's who Andrew Cuomo was talking about.
Well, Pat,
but that legislation, and I think the point the governor was making, was that legislation was supported by a bipartisan group of Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature. So I think that was the bigger point he was trying to make.
Steve, you have to agree, though, Steve, that even the people in bipartisan support of that legislation failed to read the bill, and that seems to be a big big problem these days. I mean,
well,
even the Republicans that came out and said that they're supporting this bill admitted afterwards that they didn't have time to read it.
Well,
it didn't have the normal public disclosure time.
Pat, floor is yours. Go ahead, Pat.
You do have time to read these bills. Granted, it didn't, sit out there and didn't have a lot of hearings. One of the things that ticked off a lot of that ticked off a lot of gun owners and was ultimately struck down by the courts, which said that you can't have more than 7 rounds in a automatic weapon. Turns out that manufacturers don't make magazines that can hold less than 10 rounds. So the court struck that down.
Well, doesn't that go to Steve's point, though, that it was done so rushed that he really didn't understand that? It was just put together to try to be the first one out of the box to position himself later. I mean, Pat, you mentioned that the governor has been centrist. I think that's fair to say on the fiscal side, more than centrist, actually adopting a lot of the Republican playbook. But on the social side, I think you got to say he's been more than centrist. He's been pretty outright liberal, very liberal.
Are you talking about gay marriage? Is that what you're saying?
Gay marriage, the guns, the now medical marijuana, which is not radical what he's doing. He's following the lead of others. But do you think it's calculated? Do you think it's set up because, hey, maybe I'm ticking off a lot of my base on the fiscal side. I have to shore them up on the social side.
Well, I think that the governor's actually got a pretty keen ear for where the people of New York are as a whole. Now, granted, there are people who don't agree with it, but most people, according to the polls show, support medical marijuana, and they support some tougher gun laws, and they support a person that's in love being able to marry the person that they love regardless of their sex.
Well, what do you think?
Look, New York is a progressive state. That's not to say, and frankly, I think if the governor had to do it over again, he probably wouldn't have said it quite as starkly. Mm-hmm. But New York has had a history of being a very progressive state, going back to the days of Teddy Roosevelt, a great progressive Republican, Franklin Roosevelt, Al Smith.
But what works well in New York is not really going to sell in Iowa and South Carolina and Wyoming. If he ever were to put his toe in the water, I remember the president talking about, the guns and religion quote at one of his private parties. He survived it. It didn't kill him. But then he said he had another faux pas about, you didn't build that business. Is this Governor Cuomo's moment that may come back to haunt him, like Ed Koch once made that remark about people upstate wearing seersucker suits?
Steve, I think you're onto something there, because that's one of the things that bothered us about, you can have all the debates you want about gun control laws. As you said, it's already the most, strict gun control laws state in the country. What we perceived to be happening because of the rush through was just what you said. I think this is a guy who has presidential aspirations. I think that he's catering to his liberal base. I think he's setting himself up for a presidential run, and he's using New York State as the playing ground. You don't rush through by executive order and by emergency, letters of emergency that were initiated to pass a piece of legislation without any public input. Okay, it's not done. There was no emergency, and if you look at the legislation that was passed, it's probably going to be ineffectual in the long term anyway. We suspect that it was very, very politically motivated. I think he wanted to beat President Obama to the punch on gun control, and he did. We just don't like the methods with which he did.
New York State did lead the way, but what happened after that terrible slaughter in Connecticut was that there were a number of states that passed stricter gun laws. New York, Connecticut, being some of them, but then. The NRA, who frankly are the most potent political action group in America, was able to launch a counteroffensive and beat back efforts to tougher gun laws, and actually got some states to weaken gun laws. Mm-hmm. So I think Cuomo was pretty smart in saying, let's get ahead of this before, frankly, the NRA has a chance to rally their troops and begin the onslaught on Albany. So that's what happened there. I mean, it was the first, but it wasn't. Look, this Governor Cuomo knows how to get things done in Albany like we haven't seen in a governor, at least in my lifetime. I mean, it is remarkable. He reminds me of Lyndon Johnson pushing through, the Great Society after after the Kennedy assassination.
I guess the big question is,
who's still paying the
do you
bills?
like what's getting done? And most New Yorkers are saying yes. Are we going too fast in some areas? Are we going not far enough in others? I know I've been very praiseworthy of the governor in identifying the issues. He does a very good job at that. He does a very good job of educating people what the problem are. But I've been very frustrated on the mandate side because, well, there's been talk about doing pension reform. It never really happened. There was talk about capping arbitration awards. It never really happened. What are your thoughts on that, Pat?
Well, Steve, they did pass pension reform.
But it was weak.
Well, they now have a new pension tier, which was supported in a bipartisan way overwhelmingly by Democrats and Republicans. If you're looking for New York State to move from a defined benefit to a defined contribution, I think that'll be a long time before that happens.
But isn't that the only... I mean, you still have these guys retiring, no fault of yours or mine when we were county executive, but you got cops retiring with $150,000 pensions because the overtime's allowed to be based in, and people are trying to change it, and there's talk that there was change, but it really didn't change much. They change it prospectively for new guys coming in a little bit, and it'll be 30 years before we ever feel that. It's been a little frustrating, but, at least he's addressed the issue, I have to say that. But, speaking of the fiscal matters and the budget that just came out, I want to get the perspective from you guys. Good budget, bad budget. I'll tell you what I think. I think the idea of the tax cut, again, it's a nice concept. He says the right stuff, but I was flabbergasted when I found out that it was based on a surplus that doesn't exist. There's actually a deficit in the state budget right now. It's a proposed surplus down the road. Pat, could you imagine if you or I, as county executives, said, we're going to put forth a tax cut. We have a deficit this year, but we're projecting in 2 years from now we're going to have a surplus. I can't believe he got away with that. What are your thoughts?
Well, Steve, you and I, unlike the governor, I mean, we have an obligation, a legal obligation, to balance the budget each and every year, and we were there in tough times and worked through that. It was very hard, very, very difficult. I tended to take these budgets year by year. I like the idea of projecting a budget out, but locking in a tax cut that may or may not materialize as a result of the economy growing worries me, frankly.
Well, we hope it happens, It's just
well, of course we hope it happens.
Yeah, if it doesn't, we're in trouble.
Taxes?
Now,
Steve, we better have the dough to pay for it.
Yeah, Steve?
Yeah, but Steve, as in Steve Levy, I agree with you. We've been fighting for mandate relief on our side of the ledger for a real long time. I spent a lot of years on a school board. I spent years with TaxPac. Been to Albany 1,000 times. We've talked about mandate relief, and you go to a school district where most of your property taxes, originate, and you sit there and you try and do something. You try and have some action. You try and say we want to stabilize taxes. You go to the superintendent. You go to your fellow board members. The answer is simple: mandates. We're mandated to do it. We can't do anything. All right. Mandate relief has been on the table for 25 years, as far as I can see, and nothing's being done about it. I think there's an initiative that's going to take place. Steve Levy, you've been, behind this effort along with Mike Fitzpatrick, and I know you're going to have a bill that's going to be introduced next week. We're all for it. I think we need to get to a point where the state stops mandating down to local districts. I know I was on the finance chairman for our district. We sat there and we had to initiate programs that were designed for the worst parts of New York City, for the inner city type responses that had to be implemented in our districts. We had no place for them, but we had to spend the money. We don't think that that's the way to operate. If we're going to really operate our schools and be more effective and be more cost effective, we have to get the state off our back. We have to have
Could we all agree, yeah. Pat, you as well, and we're talking with Patrick Halpin, the former county executive, and that was Steve Flanagan from Conservative Society for Action, that, there's a big rush right now. The budget came out. We've got to get more money for schools. We've got to get more money for schools. I mean, the amount, you saw it when you were an assemblyman, Pat. I saw it when I was an assemblyman. The amount of money that's thrown at schools, it's astronomical. And you have the educational establishment going down, and we need more. I don't see a correlation between the amount of money spent and performance. Do you, Pat? What are your thoughts?
Well, we spend a lot of money on education. I mean, Steve, that's your point. And we went through a period when the state had a lot of money, when the economy was booming, and more money was in education, and it did not translate into improved quality of education, and frankly, it didn't even translate into the type of property tax reduction that we had hoped for. That's why we have a tax cap now. But one of the things
credit to Governor Cuomo on that. Let's give him a hand for that.
I do. But one of the things that concerns me about public education is that there are two big cost drivers, and Steve from the conservative group, having been on the school board, you understand this. One are the salaries that are negotiated at the local level, but with binding arbitration, with the Taylor law and all that, there are real limits to what school districts and, for that matter, other government entities can do in a contract. The second thing that's a big driver, nobody wants to talk about this, is the high cost of handicap education.
You hit it on the head. Very few people want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but you are so right, sir.
And if the state is going to help school districts, I'd rather see them pick up more of the cost of that handicapped education, which can bankrupt a school district that, frankly, doesn't have a broad tax base.
And the mandates there, though, Pat, too, are pretty incredible. I mean, and I was talking to a fellow the other day who confided in me, and he just said, listen, I would never say this publicly, but, and he was a very high-up guy in a newspaper. He said, let's say you spend $1 million to get a very mentally and physically challenged person from the a 3-year-old level to a 3.5-year-old level. Is it worth another $1 million to go from the 3.5-year level to the 3 3/4 year level? Boy, that's a tough thing to talk about. But boy, we've seen it, and the costs are just going through the roof.
But there are extraordinary costs associated with it, and without getting, somebody is paying for it now, and unfortunately, the burden is falling on the property taxpayer.
Well, Steve, I want to ask you one final
one. I think that there's a need for a bigger fix. I mean, part of the problem we're seeing now is that school districts are dying deaths of 1,000 cuts. Mm-hmm. They've burned through any fund balances that they had. They still have these contracts that they have to pay for with steps, and they have increasing health care and pension costs. I don't know, frankly, unless there are big changes in the way we structure education on this island, on Long Island, where the dollars are going to come from. And I think what's going to happen is that public education is going to suffer.
Well, is it always more dollars, or is it as, I've been listening to Bill O'Reilly, and sometimes he's right, sometimes wrong. I think he hits it right in the head with this. You can throw $1 billion into a child. If that child's going home to no father and a mother who's a crack addict and has problems at the home, unless we get to the cultural fix, are we going to continue to throw bad money, good money after bad? I mean, you look at the places where there's really excelling going on. It's where you have that. It comes from the family, doesn't it, Steve?
Yeah, but it's interesting that you talk about money. Everybody talks about money in education, and we talk about the tax cap, things like that. But if you look at this current budget, you'll see that there's a large increase in spending on education here on Long Island. Okay. No school district is having a reduction in spending. It has not happened, even with the tax cap. The average increase in spending by the average Long Island school district, 127 districts, was about 3.8%. There has been no reduction in spending on education as a result of the tax cap, which I support. We have to understand that part of what the governor's budget includes are the increases that make up for the losses that are coming from property taxpayers. So I don't think dollars are the issue relative to education. And, Pat, I think you picked up on something very interesting. I was on the Committee of Special Education in my school district, and you might have one child in your district that you have to spend $1 million or $1.5 million on. And you have dozens and dozens of these types of students, and you really don't get a lot of financial aid from the state. I mean, these are special circumstances, and everybody on those committees, including myself, want to vote to give those kids the best treatment that they can get. So, I kind of agree with you, Pat, that something maybe has to be done on the special ed area.
I got a minute left, and I want you to get the last word on that, Pat. Go ahead.
This out: Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. I think if the state is going to be picking up more of these costs, that's an area to start, because it becomes this huge burden, in some cases out of left field, for school districts. And you know better than I, having worked through that as a volunteer on the school board. People should remember that.
I got 30 seconds left, guys. I want to hear from you in like 10 or 20 seconds. How important is it Patrick for the state Senate to go Democratic, and Steve for it to stay Republican. What are your thoughts, Pat?
Steve, I'm a Long Islander. I want to see Long Island strongly represented. And if it means, by the way, that Republicans control the Senate, I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Well, to be honest,
sound like Richie Schaefer there, Pat.
If you look at the numbers, the Republicans don't control the Senate. It's actually a coalition of some Democrats and Republicans. So honestly, if the numbers stay the way they are, the Democrats are in control of the Senate. So we'll probably end up staying that way. But I need Long Island suburban. I just need somebody to represent Long Island and the suburbs in the Senate, and I'm happy.
I wish I had a whole nother segment on this one. We're out of time. But listen, thank you, Patrick Halpin, former Suffolk County executive. Thank you so much for joining us, Pat. Steve Flanagan from the CSA. Thank you, folks. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steve.